From the newsroom of Impact Alpha, I'm Brian Walsh, and this is your Impact Briefing for Friday, July 8th. Today I'm joined by our Roundtable regulars to discuss the politics and power of the asset management industry, and draw a line from the massive fees earned by asset managers to the recent raft of radical decisions from the U.S. Supreme Court. Imogen Rose-Smith is an Impact Alpha contributing editor. Hi, Imogen.
Hi, Brian.
And David Bank is Impact Alpha's editor and CEO. Hi, David.
Hey, Brian, and hello, Imogen.
Great to be back with you both after a brief break. Look forward to our conversation in a moment. But first, here's what you need to know from this week in Impact Investing. The recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling in the case West Virginia versus the Environmental Protection Agency not only curtails the federal government's ability to regulate climate change producing greenhouse gases, it also puts other federal regulations in the crosshairs. Case in point, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission has proposed two new rules aimed at improving the reliability and comparability of ESG investments. These rules, one is the Fund Names Rule Amendment, and the other is the ESG Disclosure Rule, are currently open for comments. They're designed to rein in greenwashing in asset management. But with the court's EPA ruling, these could also be in jeopardy. Private equity giant KKR generated positive headlines when it shared some of the proceeds of its exit from CHI Overhead Doors with the employees of that company. But private equity employee ownership strategies deserve a closer look, so argue Marjorie Kelly and Karen Kahn of the Democracy Collaborative in a guest post on Impact Alpha. For example, when KKR bought Gibson Guitars in 2018, it piled $250 million in new debt onto the company's balance sheet, and then channeled $225 million of that to KKR's partners as a special dividend. The authors say that just $7 million went to Gibson's 800 employees. That works out to less than $9,000 each. In this week's deal flow, TPG Rise Climate backed Intersect Power, which raised $750 million for renewable infrastructure. Intersect Power is the San Francisco-based clean energy company that develops utility-scale solar projects and will use the new capital to expand into green hydrogen and wind energy. Leapfrog backed Shubham to help low-income homebuyers in India get mortgages. The lender helps first-time buyers who don't have the documents required by other lenders. Shubham uses data collection, machine learning, and other tech-enabled tools to underwrite its loan process. And finally, so far most Opportunity Zone investments have gone into real estate deals, not business financing. Opzo, a Black-led Miami-based fintech, is trying to tackle the obstacles to financing faced by small businesses in Opportunity Zones. Opzo provides up to $1 million in asset-backed working capital loans to small businesses. Now it's time for our featured conversation, and I'm joined once again by Imogen and David. Now, Imogen, there's been a backlash against ESG from some quarters who argue that people shouldn't be politicizing asset management with their social agendas. In your recent institutional impact column, you make the case that asset management has always been politicized. So what do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is asset management, in particular public pension plans, are political by nature. They are, for the most part, run by elected officials who have political agendas. And, the idea is that your fiduciary duty is meant to mean that you put investment first, but the reality on the ground is much more complicated. And this is even more true, by the way, these days of sovereign wealth funds, which often explicitly have a political agenda behind what they're doing. But, when we think about ESG, it's naive to think that ESG is not in some way, shape, or form political, right? Like, if you look at the states that tend to invest in climate initiatives, they are more often than not blue states. And more often than not, the goals of, pushing to combat climate change coincide with the political beliefs and agendas of the elected officials in charge, which is not to say that they're not making these decisions with sound financial reasons to do so, but it's naive to assume that there has not historically been a political element to some of those decisions that are being made.
I think Imogen is right on that. I think it was sort of a convenient fiction on the part of the pro ESG or the pro impact side to sort of claim that it was some kind of objective truth as opposed to its own agenda. Now you might or might not agree with that agenda, but it clearly has a political element, which we've seen as the politics have become more heated. I will say that the backlash, which has been gaining strength, is itself a sign of the strength of ESG. In a sense, it's winning, and so states like West Virginia or Texas, public pension plans feel obliged now to take a stand, against it, precisely because the arguments have become so powerful in favor of it.
To be fair, it's not the public pension plans; it's the state legislature that's imposing actions on the pension funds. But I remember talking to the CIO of the West Virginia pension system like a decade ago and suggesting something about ESG, and he was like this super nice guy, and all of a sudden he like started yelling at me. I was like, "Oh, I guess no." Like, I mean, it's really people can respond really viscerally to this, but it's not it's not as easy as Republican states versus Democratic states. One of the things that's happened is there are starting to be economic impacts from climate change, that we can make a financial argument as well as a sort of political and logical argument. Climate change investing is starting to have traction. And also on the sort of the value side, people are recognizing that diversity is important, that the morality matters. And it's not as black and white as just, red states versus blue states. You do see, for example, a lot of DEI initiatives happening in red states, particularly in somewhere like Texas. And again, this tends to be at public pension plans where, despite, all the functionality that is Texas, organized labor is actually still pretty powerful, and DEI is something they care about. So if you take climate change out of the equation, it's not necessarily just, as I said, red states versus blue states.
So, Imogen, and just to clarify, by DEI, you mean diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in your latest institutional impact column, you make a very fiery case. Really, the gloves came off from Imogen, so to speak, that the funding provided by prominent asset managers to political figures has directly contributed to a dramatically rightward, and you make the case, radical shift in U.S. politics, which we see culminated in the recent string of Supreme Court decisions that just came out. Why such a fiery case?
Well, I think the recent string of Supreme Court decisions that we've seen, including sort of the overturning of Roe versus Wade, the effectively neutering of the EPA, and other decisions, including, gun rights and Miranda rights, as we all know, are having a significant and potentially devastating impact on civil liberties and progress that has been made over the last 50 years, in particular, women's rights to choose, but also the implication is an attack on civil rights more generally. The Supreme Court that is making these rulings was very clearly put in place by the actions that the GOP has taken over, let's call it, the last 6 years, starting with the election of Trump, and Mitch McConnell's initiatives around the judiciary. And that GOP agenda has been bankrolled by a key handful of funders, including some from the asset management industry, most particularly and well-known Steve Schwartzman, but there are others.
Steve Schwartzman, the CEO of Blackstone, right?
Yes. So the mammoth private equity firm Blackstone, which has a lot of investments from public pension plans, as well as other institutional investors.
And which has a now quite visible ESG impact agenda and fundraising efforts.
Exactly. And there's always been, so you can look at, and so one of the things I did is I looked at who are the biggest donors to the GOP during the last 3 election cycles. And you'll see, there are asset managers or people who have made their wealth from the asset management industry who have been sizable donors on both the left and the right. And this isn't news. This isn't a new thing. This has been happening as long as asset managers have been getting rich. And for the most part, we just overlook it. The difference now is that these donors are contributing to a party that they clearly know has this incredibly, fascist-leaning right-wing agenda that is going out of its way to dismantle civil liberties, including things, say, like civil rights, that, most individuals and, most unions and most pension beneficiaries are in favor of. And that, have the danger of, causing social unrest and having negative social and financial impacts on our economy and on our society. So in the past, you would be like, well, and this, there's an FT article about this a year ago. So there were activists who were pushing back saying pension plans shouldn't be investing in Blackstone because Steve Schwarzman is such a contributor to the GOP and such, and friends with Trump. And the public pension plans were like, no, we would never mix, politics with our fiduciary duty. Our fiduciary duty is to invest in the best manager possible. Blackstone's awesome. So we gave them a bunch of money. The problem is that now that what Steve Schwarzman is contributing to, and look, as far as we know, Steve Schwarzman is totally in favor of a women's right to choose, right? No one's suggesting that he personally necessarily believes the same ideology as, the extreme religious right that has taken over the views of the Supreme Court. However, the quid pro quo within the GOP is that the sort of, low tax, low regulation crowd have teamed up with the evangelicals to create this mess that we're in. And it's that teaming up that's the problem. And so the point I'm making is that you can no longer use the excuse of fiduciary duty to overlook what the likes of Schwarzmans are doing, and the fact that their wealth is built largely on institutions such as public pension plans. And that also extends, I would argue, to, foundations and endowments, especially those who want to think of themselves as being mission aligned.
And why does it matter the source? Because there are lots of wealthy donors to the GOP, right? And Steve Schwarzman made his contributions to the GOP in his personal capacity. He didn't make it in his professional capacity as the CEO of Blackstone. And it wasn't Blackstone's money going to the GOP, although don't quote me on that because maybe there are some corporate funds that have contributed to different PACs over the years, I'm sure. But it's Steve Schwarzman acting in his capacity as an individual citizen, right, to finance these elections in the manner he sees fit and use his financial capital as his voice, which the Supreme Court has argued is constitutionally protected speech. And so my question is, do we go after the sources of wealth of other, political actors whose views we don't agree with, or why are you kind of putting in your crosshairs, if you will, your rhetorical crosshairs, the asset managers?
Because I'm not making an activist argument, I'm making a fiduciary argument, right? My argument is effectively the same argument as like the shareholder commons' argument, which is that it's not a Republican, it's not an I want to be very clear about this. It's not an anti-Republican argument. It's not an anti, writing big checks to politicians argument. I think we need campaign finance reform. I think it's disgusting that there's so much money in politics, but that's the reality. My point is, when the GOP got taken over by a bunch of hacks and, pursued what is an extremist, fascio-Christian agenda that is arguably damaging to the US economy, then you as an investor have arguably a fiduciary duty to consider what the impact is of the fees that you're paying to these institutions. And at the top of these institutions are individuals like Steve Schwarzman who are making those political donations. So at the point it becomes, disruptive and dangerous, it seems like that there is a both ethical but also economic responsibility to step in and take a look at this.
And there are economic and financial implications, as Imogen argues, certainly on the on the Roe v. Wade and abortion rights and reproductive rights side, but most pointedly on this other decision that came down on West Virginia versus EPA, which curtailed the EPA's ability to regulate the emissions from power plants. And you'd think, anti-regulatory, pro-business, but there were many corporations, including some power utilities and others that wanted to be regulated because they want to be, in a sense, forced to do the right thing to get on the right side of the climate change issues, and they want those rules to be fair across the whole industry. So therefore, let everybody play by the same rules. They'll be happy to compete. Instead, now we have this sort of scattershot kind of policymaking that has to somehow walk a fine line to get through the courts, and everybody's sort of wondering what they can do. So it's not necessarily a pro-business argument that the court is. It's some kind of other agenda that's being played out.
But that's also my point, right? Like, don't say you care about climate change and then give a bunch of money to someone who is supporting the dismantling of the EPA, right? Like, you can't dislodge the individual from the institution. The individual is making mostly his money through the institution, and that institution is built on the back of fees that are paid from investors.
You mentioned the shareholder commons, which I think is this notion, what they call, sort of wonky term, beta stewardship. But the notion is that there's these broader systemic risks that investors and asset managers have to account for, as well as the particular, selections of stocks and other investments they make. And that in some cases, these broader systemic risks, whether it be climate change or income inequality or women's empowerment or disempowerment, as the case may be, can outweigh whatever smarts they might have about picking stocks.
Yeah, and look, what Steve Schwarzman does with his money would be none of my business if it wasn't for the fact that the politicians that his funding helped put in place resulted in the dismantlement of Roe versus Wade and my control over my healthcare decisions. And as I said, the sort of the social and economic impacts of that. So it used to be that we turned a blind eye to it. That the First Amendment exists, that wealthy fund managers were allowed to do whatever they want with their money, and that very well that should still be the case. However, two things have happened. One is this extreme right shift that has been funded by a key group of very wealthy people, and the other is this creation of ginormous pools of wealth which allow people to have this outsized political influence, and some of those ginormous pools of wealth come from the asset management industry.
I want to get back to this politicization question, because I do think if we agree that ESG impact, what have you, has been politicized, then it's incumbent, and we've talked about that many times in this podcast, for there to be actually a political movement and a popular support for those kind of policies, both investment policies but also public policies. And if the court's saying, well, Congress or the elected officials need to delegate this responsibility to the agencies to regulate, say, climate change, then let's get a popular groundswell behind getting those elected officials to set those policies. I mean, if it's going to be political, then let's actually get political.
Are you familiar with the gridlock that is Washington?
all too familiar.
But I mean, it is on the. It is. You see lots of legislation going through state legislatures around like pension plans all the time, including ESG. So there's constantly New York State is constantly fighting like policies to divest from fossil fuels, like and investment offices don't like these kind of blanket policies. They would rather kind of get there on their own. So, but and arguably that's what the whole fossil fuel divestment movement was about, and it's been effective. But again, it's been really effective because there is also an economic argument.
So where do we go from here, Imogen?
Campaign finance reform.
Broad political mobilization.
Money out of politics. So short of campaign finance reform, Imogen, what about the number of what might be self-described mission-aligned investors, whether they be pension funds or endowments or the like charitable organizations that have their money with organizations like Blackstone and the like. Have you seen in your reporting, any movement there to have these mission-aligned investors, put their money where their mouth is and move away from doing business with and generating the fees that kind of create the fortunes that then finance these political agendas?
That's a really good question, Brian, and that's sort of the point I was trying to make earlier. That I think that there is precedent for this with organized labor, like when you had a handful of pension managers who started campaigning for defined benefit pension reform and or charter schools. Unions got very upset and did what unions do very well, and they jumped up and down and they protested and they marched, and they put pressure on elected officials who again were overseeing public pension plans to stop investing in hedge funds, or if not in hedge funds broadly, in specific hedge funds. And they had a fair amount of success, in part because overall performance of hedge funds, although not necessarily individual hedge funds, has been really poor for the last decade. And also because I think there is some validity to the case of, why should a defined benefit pension plan be giving fees to a money manager who is using his wealth to end the future of defined benefit pension plans, right? So there has been some success there, and it's still kind of a touchy issue that flares up every now and then. The point I'm really making is we should apply that analysis more broadly to both investing in general and more narrowly to impact investing. And when we think about mission alignment, again, it's not about a purity test. It's not saying, my values must perfectly align with the values of the investment manager that I'm giving money to. But if I'm giving someone like a boat ton of fees, I think it's reasonable to expect that they don't turn around and fuel, a toxic GOP that I think is doing terrible harm to the country, and therefore going to be negatively beneficial to the long-term health of my investment portfolio. Not to mention is not aligned with my mission.
All right, well, that seems like a good place to end it. Thank you so much, Imogen Rose Smith.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you, David Bank.
What she said.
All right, that's going to do it for this week's Impact Briefing. Thanks to David, Imogen, and our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. Subscribe to Impact Alpha to get full access to all of our content, including the daily email brief. Right now, we're offering podcast listeners $100 off their first year subscription. You can go to impactalpha.com/subscribe and use the code briefing100. I'm Brian Walsh, head of sustainability for the capital markets firm TP ICAP. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, take good care.